It's finally here! I have been waiting for this day for a long time, but it is finally time to talk about the books that I'm gonna read in autumn. I don't really have much of a prelude to this. It's a new season, it's time for some new books. Autumn, first up, is my favourite season and it's the season that I'm the most excited about. So I tend to, I guess, read my favourite genres in autumn as well. I'm in the mood for something very cozy, something very atmospheric. I tend to read a lot of fantasy. I've tried to stick to not all fantasy because I think that if I spend the next 3 months reading nothing but fantasy all the way down, I might get a little bit bored, or I don't know, it doesn't seem very diverse as well, so I don't really want to be falling into that trap. So I've tried to add a few books that aren't strictly fantasy but still fit the right autumny vibes. First book on my little list of autumn themed books is Autumn by Ali Smith. This one is the first book in the seasonal quartet that Ali Smith wrote. It's a relatively well-known sort of literary fiction contemporary quartet of books, one for each season of the year, and it starts in autumn, and I've never got around to reading it, and I also kind of want to read each book in the season that it is named after, even if it doesn't necessarily fit. So I've been waiting for autumn to start so that I can read the first one. But yeah, I honestly don't know much about what the series is actually about. I only know that it is very much sort of literary fiction contemporary, so I'm curious to actually read it and see if I can get to know a bit more of what these books are actually about, what they feature. The next book on my list will come as no surprise at all, and that is The Hobbit. Lord of the Rings has been one of my favourite books and favourite series basically since I was in like primary school, but I never actually read The Hobbit until I had already joined BookTube only a few years ago. So I read this a long time after I read Lord of the Rings, and I've never reread it, but I feel like it's time to do a reread. I really want to dive into this and do some more exploration. Last time I read it, I wrote some notes, but I'm kind of excited to dive a bit more deeply into it and maybe see what else I can find on a reread and how many more notes I can add to it. So that's what I'm going to be doing as well, which I'm super excited about. The next book on my list is a large one, and one that I have taken a long time to get around to reading, and that is Priory of the Orange Tree. This is another book that I feel like I probably don't need to like give a full explanation of, because I feel like I'm coming to the Priory of the Orange Tree very late in the game and everyone else has already read and knows what it is. But this is that sort of standard epic fantasy where there's lots of intertwined story arcs and character arcs happening and pieces moving in the very complex chess game that epic fantasy can sometimes be. What I do know about this book is that it seems to feature a war, like a long-standing war between two different lands, that it features at least one dragon, and that it also features a lot of women and female characters as the main characters of the novel, which is very exciting because quite often epic fantasy is dominated by men. So super excited to be giving this one a read this season. Next little autumn book on my list is Beowulf. This one that I am going to be reading is this translation and commentary by Tolkien. I think this was like put together by his son. It was never published by Tolkien himself. Basically, it's Tolkien's translation of the original Beowulf, so from Old English into slightly more understandable English, and it also features some of his lectures that he gave on Beowulf at Oxford University in the 30s. So there's a lot of Tolkien's sort of commentary and analysis and study of Beowulf and its impact on the fantasy genre and stuff as well. So I'm super excited to be A, reading Beowulf for the first time, and B, getting to gain a better understanding of how Beowulf as a puzzle piece fits into the puzzle of fantasy and the genre of fantasy as a whole. Next book on my little list of autumn books is probably the one that I'm the most excited about, and that is Legends and Lattes, which I fully impulse added to my list after seeing it go around Instagram and Book Talk and things. So I don't think this book needs any introduction by me, but this is a cozy fantasy about an orc who was previously like an adventurer or battler of some kind who has finally decided she's going to hang up her sword and start a cafe instead. But all of this is happening in a very high fantasy world where people have never even heard of coffee, let alone drunk it. So then I guess a lot of shenanigans ensue from that, but it's supposedly quite a high fantasy but low stakes plot. So it should be very easy read, very atmospheric. I'm just super excited about it. I think it's going to be a really good autumn read. Next up, we're finally diversifying from the fantasy genre with On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This one has an autumny cover, but I don't think it's necessarily very autumnal in, I guess, themes. My gut reaction is almost to want to read it in winter instead. It feels more of a wintry book than an autumny book, and don't ask me why. I don't know why. That's just how my brain works. But I figured I should probably try and diversify my reading a little bit this season as well, which is why I have brought this book into autumn instead of reading it in winter. It's written as a letter from the main character, Little Dog, to his mother, who can't read, and he comes from a Vietnamese family, and it's basically exploring or unearthing some of their family history and exploring the impacts of their family history, in particular the way their family was impacted by the war in Vietnam and how they've sort of struggled to move on and find a new life after that. This book is still being tagged as poetry on Goodreads, so I'm not sure if it's perhaps like sort of long form poetry or if it's just got a poetic style to it, but it seems to predominantly be this kind of contemporary literary fiction novel exploring this family history. Next up on my list, and the last of the physical books that I currently own that I want to read in autumn, is Possession by A.S. Vaite. This book seems to be the kind of book that you would probably put on like a recommendation list for like romantic academia reads. It's about two young scholars who are studying and like researching the history of two poets and like researching their lives and where they went and that kind of stuff. And apparently it's also a romance novel. I'm not sure if that romance is between like the two scholars in like the present day of the novel or if it's between the two poets that they're researching, but yeah, there's a lot of historical fiction, there's a bit of a sort of classic element to it, a bit of academia and a bit of romance as well. All of that seems pretty cozy to me, so I'm excited to be giving this a read, and this is also one of my few non-fantasy reads that is happening this month as well. After that, I have a little selection of books that I don't own yet that I also want to read. Some of them hopefully as audiobooks, some of them I might buy as ebooks or might purchase as a little treat as we go through the autumn season. So the first one is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This one is apparently a bit of a Gothic mystery novel. The main character gets a letter from her newlywed cousin that's basically begging her to please come and visit and save her from some mysterious impending doom that's happening. It seems like it features quite a lot of those classic family secrets and madness and violence and those things that we associate with the Gothic genre that we know and love. So a bit of a sort of Gothic mystery, apparently also with some horror elements, and it sounds like it also might have a bit of a fantasy twist to it as well, which is why I've chosen to read it in autumn as well. Another book on the list is Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. This one is, I think, the only YA fantasy that I've selected for myself so far. This book is, from what I understand, about the main character who is a trans boy and his sort of traditionalist family isn't accepting his gender, so he goes and does some kind of ritual. So he decides to go on a bit of a quest to sort of prove himself to his family, which involves apparently finding the ghost of his murdered cousin and setting it free. I don't know what that means. It also involves a ritual, and I think it involves some spirit being called either from the spirit world or like the spirit of someone who's died, or if it's, yeah, I'm not quite sure. So it's like young adult urban fantasy with a queer romance element to it as well, and I'm excited to read something that's a bit more lighthearted, a bit more of a fast-paced, less like slow-paced epic fantasy. Yeah, a nice read to slot in between some of those longer and heavier fantasy reads. Also on the list is God Killer by Hannah Kaner. This one is about someone who goes around killing gods. She goes around killing gods for a living, and then she finally comes across the one god that she can't kill. And that's also tied into some other main character who's like a noble in hiding or on the run from something. And that's all that I know in terms of like the plot hooks of the story. But this one also, another fantasy book. It sounds like it has some mythology elements to it, and it also sounds like it might have some queer romance happening in it as well. And the final book on my list is The Hidden Palace by Helene Wecker. This one is actually the sequel to The Golem and the Jinni, which was one of my top reads when I read that book a few years ago. I did not know that there was a sequel. I fully thought that it was a standalone, but then I found out that there's actually a sequel to it. And so I'm really excited to be reading this one as well. I won't talk about what this book is about because I don't want to necessarily spoil anything that happened in the first book, but The Golem and the Jinni is about the two main characters, Ahmed, who is a golem, and Shava, who is a jinni, and they they both end up in New York City for reasons that are kind of beyond their control, and they're both trying to sort of pass as humans and live an ordinary life in New York City. Then the story kind of follows how they meet, the forming of their friendship, and the ways in which their lives have actually been like intertwined before they ever got to New York. So it's a bit of a combination of historical fiction because it's set in New York in the lead up to either World War I or World War II. So it's got that fantasy element and it's got that historical fiction element to it as well. And then it's got a bit of a sort of fabulism, mythology kind of element to it as well. That's the extent of the books that I am interested in reading over the next few months as I get right down and cozy and autumnal. So that ends up being 11 books apparently, which is not quite 4 books a month. 1 month we'll end up having 3 books a month, which feels moderately doable. I did get through all the books that I set for myself in summer, which was I think 3 books a month. So this one's a little bit more, but I do feel like I'm on track to have a successful reading season for autumn as well, and I'm excited to be reading all of these books. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear what you think of them, whether or not you recommend them. If you're interested in reading any of these books, feel free to hit me up. I'm always down for a buddy read or something like that. I will see you for another video very shortly, I am sure. And until then, as always, stay classic.